Hello again. Welcome back. This is the second part of our panel discussion today, and I have the pleasure to moderate the part that is going to introduce to you the work that is being done, because we have started but we are far from finishing, under the third research strand in our project. The name of our research strand is Relevance and Value of Universities for the Future. And in this strand, we are quite a bunch of people doing several different things. Actually, we changed the order, of today's presentations, because while listening to the first part, we thought it would be probably more logical to continue with something which initially we called a small-scale research project into young people's engagement with civic and political life. That was our, initial idea, for it to be a small-scale research project. I have to admit that it turned out a little bit larger scale than planned. We are absolutely happy about it, and you will understand why in a moment. So in this research strand, we have the enormous pleasure to work with two renowned scholars. This is Professor Michael Byram, who is sitting next to me. Professor Michael Byram is Professor Emeritus at the University of Durham, but also Research Professor at Sofia University for several years now, and Professor Martyn Barrett, who is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Surrey, and is now part of our research group. Both Professor Byram and Professor Barrett have been engaged over years in what the Council of Europe is doing in connection with intercultural communication, intercultural citizenship, democratic citizenship, and you will understand a little bit more about it in a moment. So back to our small-scale research. It is comparative research that explores certain aspects of civic and political engagement and their relation to values, behaviors, and attitudes in Bulgaria, but also in several other countries. And here I would like to thank a lot our colleagues from the University of Katowice in Poland, our colleagues from the University, Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas in Lithuania, our colleagues from Mariupol State University in Ukraine, and our colleagues from Surrey University in the UK, who found the topic relevant to their own research interests and agreed to run the survey in their own countries. I think I would like to give the floor to Professor Barrett here, because what he has prepared to share with you has, a lot in common with what we have been introduced to in the morning. And he's going to shift the focus a little bit to, how political life influences people's lives, people's ideas, and more specifically, young people's. So, Professor Barrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Nina. Basically, sorry, we have technical problems in that, right, that has worked. So the project that we're working on is called the EUVaSC study, and the reason for this is, right, okay, first slide. That what we're investigating specifically are the values, attitudes, skills, and the civic and political engagement of young people. Specifically, we're looking at the relationship between, on the one hand, the values, attitudes, and skills of the young people, and on the other hand, their civic and political engagement. This is really the crucial relationship we're looking at. As we've said, we're focusing primarily upon youth, and by youth, operationally, we're defining that in our project as school students who are aged 16 years and over, and university students as well. So these are our two main groups that we're actually working with. And what we're really interested in doing is documenting and understanding the specific values that are held by these youth. And this is where partly there will be a connection with the preceding session today, but also how those values link on to their civic and political engagement. And we're looking at whether that linkage is direct or whether it's actually mediated through other variables. So we're essentially, this is a psychological project in which we're drilling down to the psychology of the individual citizen, the youth citizen. We're collecting the data from youth in 5 countries, as Nina has said, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is just give you an introduction to some of the theoretical background to the study and some of the main hypotheses that we're testing. We're not yet at a stage where we've got definitive results to report, but Nina later on will be saying something more about where we're at the present time in this project. So the conceptualization of values that we're drawing upon, it's the work of Schwartz in particular, who has a long tradition of doing research on values in different populations. Now, one of the things to draw your attention to is a conceptual distinction between values on the one hand and attitudes on another. Schwartz postulates that these are two different things. Next slide, please. And some of the differences in terms of, in the case of attitudes, an attitude is an overall mental orientation that an individual has towards someone or something, something that's quite concrete. There is an attitude object. And usually there are 4 components to an attitude. You know, if you think about, you like sports, let's say, you have an attitude towards sports. If you like sports, then you have an emotional feeling towards that. It's basically a positive emotion of some kind. You're making an evaluation, which is that there is a positive value attached to that thing that you have the attitude towards. You have a belief or opinion often about the object of the attitude. For example, that sports are good, for example, for physical well-being and perhaps for identification with a unit like a football club, for example, that is good. And there is also a tendency to behave in a particular way towards that object. So you're likely to watch the sporting events and so on. So you've got these different components of attitudes. Now, by contrast, values are very general abstract beliefs. They're much more general than attitudes, according to Schwartz, and they relate to the desirable goals that people want to strive for in their lives. Most crucially, a value, unlike an attitude, has some kind of normative, prescriptive quality attached to it. In other words, something that this is what you ought to do or what you ought to think. So there's a normative element to them. Now, Schwartz maintains, because values, they are so general and so abstract, they actually have transsituational applicability. In other words, you can apply them across many different kinds of situations, and you can do lots of different things with values. So, for example, you can use them to make judgments about actions, both your own actions and the actions of other people as well. You can use them to justify behaviors or attitudes or opinions. You can use them to plan your own behavior. What should I do in this particular situation? You've got alternatives. You can use them to help you decide between the alternatives, and you can use them to try and influence other people as well. So you can do lots of different things with your values, okay? There are other differences between values and attitudes as well. For example, attitudes are usually measured using like-dislike scales. You're probably all familiar with these kinds of scales, or positive-negative scales. But instead, attitudes, because they're about important goals in life, they're measured in terms of how important that value is to the individual. Importance judgments are what are crucial. And attitudes and values, they also differ in terms of how central they are to your own self-concept. And values are usually felt to be much more central to who you are, how you conceive yourself, than attitudes. And because of this, you can sometimes change people's attitudes. You know, social psychologists have a lot of different persuasion techniques that they can tell you about, that you can use to change people's attitudes. Whereas values, the research actually shows they're very difficult to change when people have a value. And the reason for this is because of the threat to the self that's experienced when someone tries to change your values. So they're much harder to change than attitudes. Next slide, please. So the relationship between values and attitudes, you know, they're not just different things, they are also interrelated, of course, because attitudes sometimes, not always, but sometimes they have a value expressive function. And so one value can be linked to a lot of different attitudes. So for example, in the second bullet here, I've put an example. If you attach a high importance to the value of equality, there may be lots of different values that the individual has that value is expressed through. For example, affirmative action programs, racial discrimination, socioeconomic inequalities, and so on. Your attitudes to all of these things are likely to be linked to your underlying value of valuing equality, thinking equality is an important goal in life. And so if a person, and this has been empirically demonstrated, if a person changes their values, if you manage to do this, and it is very difficult to do, but if you manage to do this, lots of attitudes can subsequently change as a consequence. So values and attitudes are interrelated. So there are lots of empirical findings about values, stemming largely from the work of Schwartz. He has actually developed lots of different ways to measure people's values, and these have been used really extensively, not just in individual studies with individual samples, but in large-scale studies like the European Social Survey, for example. Some of his measures have been incorporated there. And now, you know, it's really impressive, this body of work, that they've been used, some of these scales, with over 340 samples of people in 83 different countries. And that's just at the last count. You know, this is as of a few years ago, and there are probably even more studies out there now. And some of the samples in those studies are absolutely enormous, over 5,000 people in some of those samples. And basically, these studies have converged. I mean, this is what's really interesting. Across cultures, across countries, there seem to be 19 broad values that different people regard as being important guiding principles in their lives. Now, different people will endorse different values, and some of the subsets of values are endorsed more in some countries than in other countries. There are country-level analyses as well as individual-level analyses in this body of work. Next slide, please. Now, basically, some of these 19 values that Schwartz has identified are compatible with each other. If you hold one of the values, you're very likely to hold one of the other values. But some are incompatible. So if you hold one, you're very unlikely, statistically, to hold a different sort of attitude. And this pattern of compatibilities and incompatibilities means you've got systematic relationships between these different values. And what Schwartz's data have actually shown is that these values form a circle that reflect these various patterns of compatibility and incompatibility. And in this diagram, I'm going to put up the next slide, please. The closer two values are to each other, the more compatible they are, and the further away they are around this circle, the more incompatible they are. So the 19 values are the 19 things in that inner circle there. So, for example, benevolence, caring and dependability, self-direction, thought and action. Those are compatible with each other, whereas, for example, universalism and benevolence seem to be incompatible with achievement and power values. People who have universal and benevolence as values that they hold very strongly are very unlikely to hold the achievement and power values as well. And they seem to be psychologically incompatible with each other. And Schwartz has got various ways of classifying these values, which are represented in the circles around this diagram. But the 19 values are the ones that are in the center of that diagram. Now, crucially, and this is where the link is made, if you like, with either EU values or European values. We were talking about what does the EU stand for in the title of this project. Those values, if you think of them, are things like human rights, democracy, rule of law, and at the Council of Europe, where Mike and I have done a lot of our work over the years, there's effectively a fourth value of intercultural dialogue since 2008, when they published the white paper on intercultural dialogue. Now, if you think about human rights, what are they? Universal values. So you can locate those in universalism. Rule of law is inherently universal, a universal value. Intercultural dialogue links in with universalism, tolerance that is up there as well. So you can see where these values are located within the Schwartz circle. It is in that top left-hand side of the circle. It's the values of universalism and benevolence. Right, so next slide, please. In our study, what we're doing, we're using one of Schwartz's very well-established, validated questionnaires to measure the values that are held to be important by the young people that we're looking at. And so for each individual person, we are collecting data on all 19 values, how important they think each one of those 19 values is to them personally. And we're predicting that 5 of these 19 values are going to be positively related to positive patterns of civic and political engagement, with 3 of the values, the 3 that were on the opposite side of the circle, being negatively related to those positive patterns of engagement. And in the table at the bottom, that's a summary. So the universalism and benevolence values, positive relationships, the achievement and power values, negatively related. Next slide, please. We're also, however, looking at attitudes and skills as well. Now, the specific attitudes and skills that we've selected to study in this project come from something called the Reference Framework of Competencies for Democratic Culture, which has been developed by the Council of Europe, by the Education Department. It's a set of materials that can be used by education systems to foster and promote the development of the competencies that are required for civic and political engagement. And basically, the framework as a whole describes a set of 20 competencies that are required by an individual. Those are the psychological resources which are claimed to be important for effective, for positive and effective civic and political engagement by citizens. And out of the full set of 20 competencies, we chose 7 of these to study in our project. And we chose these 7 because we've got what we think are really good internationally validated measures for those 7. So that's why we homed in on those 7 out of the 20 for our study. So next slide, please. These are the specific attitudes and skills that we're studying in this project. Openness to cultural otherness and to other beliefs, worldviews and practices. respect for people from other cultural groups, civic-mindedness and self-efficacy, and skills, empathy, construed as perspective taking, being able to take the perspective, see the world from the point of view of another person, which is actually a cognitive skill. Empathy is sometimes used for affective dimensions as well, but we're looking at perspective taking in particular. Flexibility and adaptability, both cognitive and behavioral, and linguistic and communicative skills. These are the 7 attitudes and skills that we are studying in this study. Next slide, please. And we've got various forms of civic and political engagement that we're studying. The 7 different forms that we've identified, we've chosen those because, once again, this is an international project, and we wanted to use well-established, validated measures. And these various measures, the 7 that you can see in the table on the screen, are ones that we've got very good measures for. We've taken them from ICCS, this big international study, and these are very well-established, validated measures. So this is what we're actually measuring in the study. We're also, next slide please, capturing demographic information as well, capturing a lot of demographic information about the participants. Again, we're using fairly well-established measures from these sorts of surveys with youth in particular, and especially ICCS, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. So you can see the demographic information that we're capturing there. Next slide, please. So we're going to be looking at a number of hypotheses. Next slide, please. And this is the first one, okay? It is the hypothesis that these values will directly predict levels of civic and political engagement in youth. Now, we've got 7 different forms of engagement. This is a quantitative study. We're going to be running factor analyses on these scores. It might be the case that these 7 measures of engagement form a single factor, that they're all interrelated to each other. In other words, the more likely you engage in one behavior, the more likely you are to engage in all of the others. Or it could be that they form a set of sub-factors. For example, in previous studies, some of the previous studies I've done, we've found a distinction between online participation in youth versus offline participation. In other studies, there are basically distinctions that have been found between legal forms of participation and illegal. So by illegal, I mean things like holding up traffic in a street protest, spraying graffiti, and so on, as illegal forms. And in some studies, there's evidence of a disjunction between engaging in legal and in illegal. Well, we will see what happens when we factor analyze our 7 forms of civic and political participation. So the outcome measure, which is in the big box on the right, is basically, we don't exactly know yet because we haven't got all the data in, we haven't run the factor analyses, so it could just be one big analysis or it could be 7 separate analyses, but we're going to look to see the extent to which these 5 positive values relate to these forms of engagement. Next slide, please. The second hypothesis is that the 3 values that were on the opposite side of the circle are negatively related. We will examine that aspect of Schwartz's theory in this study. Next slide, please. Hypothesis 3. We're then going to look to see if those attitudes and skills independently predict these outcome measures or not. The RFCDC is saying these are vital competencies you require for different forms of civic and political engagement. So we're going to empirically test that claim. So that's the third hypothesis, whether those 7 attitudes and skills predict the outcome measure. Hypothesis 4 is basically based upon the proposal by Schwartz and other people who work on values that that attitudes serve a value expressive function. So we're going to look to see if if these 5 values, the universalism and benevolence values, whether they predict the attitudes that we're measuring, and if Schwartz is right, we should find connections there. That's hypothesis 4. And the next slide, please. Okay, this is the biggie. This is the complicated one. It depends what comes out of those preceding analyses. But if the theoretical predictions are upheld, we can test this model statistically as well. We're collecting the data to test this. And that is that the values influence the forms of civic and political engagement, but the effect is mediated by the attitudes and skills. So, whether it's worth conducting this analysis will depend on what comes out of the preceding analyses. So we shall see whether we get this far. This is an empirical question, and we'll see what happens with the data. So next slide, please. We've also got additional exploratory hypotheses, particularly in relationship to the demographic characteristics. We will be exploring demographic variations in the data. Largely, these analyses will be exploratory, though, rather than theory-driven. But if we find demographic differences, which I really think we will, previous research has found differences in patterns of engagement according to young people's age. So in a previous study, we actually looked at a wide age range, 16-year-olds versus 26-year-olds, and we found quite profound differences. 16 is pre-voting age in virtually every country, whereas 26, it's early adulthood and people have the right to vote. And so in that project, we're finding age differences. Well, in our study, we can compare, for example, the school students with the university students and see what differences come out. There are gender differences in civic and political engagement. There are differences between minority ethnic groups within countries versus majority groups. Socioeconomic status is another important one. Wrote a book in 2019 with a colleague in which we document all of the existing evidence that have been published up to that point in time about these demographic differences. So we are expecting to have these differences. So I will end at that point. Basically, the project is financed by the European Union, by this grant, which is really important to mention. And is there one more? Yes, okay. So thank you for listening to me. Nina is going to pick up the threads here. Yeah. If you want to contact me about anything, that's my email address. Please don't hesitate to contact me. But perhaps just one final word, and that is, if we find, or depending upon what we find, because it's not if we find, it's what we find, this can feed into recommendations on how education can be used as a resource to foster and promote the values and the patterns of engagement that we want to see in European citizens. And this is very much the work that both Mike and I have been doing at the Council of Europe in recent years, because there will be policy recommendations that will come out of the work. If you want to encourage this type of behavior, these are the kinds of values and attitudes that you need your education systems to promote. And we've been working on sets of recommendations on suitable types of curricula and pedagogies, forms of assessment, the use of a whole school approach and so on, that can be used to foster precisely these values at school level, so the 16-year-olds upward, but also in higher education, there's a whole guidance document that's been written on how higher education can be used to promote the competences that are required for civic engagement. So using education as a means to address the sorts of issues that we were hearing about this morning, the crisis, whatever we want to call it, in relationship to democratic backsliding and so on, if we can call it democratic backslide. Someone this morning said, no, I don't like this term, but in relationship to the issues that we were hearing about earlier today. So, okay, at that point I will shut up and
Thank you, Martyn. Thank you. That was a very important thing to say, that we're not just running statistical models, and we don't just want to, can you change the presentation, please? That we would like to be able to make conclusions and formulate recommendations that would be relevant to the educational systems in our country and in the other countries where we're doing this comparative research. And this is why we have started it in the first place, because probably something more to say about our team, because we have a few more people on the team, like Professor Tsvetkova, who is on the team, and Martyn was here until a moment ago. Martyn Milanov, who is a PhD student finishing his PhD degree. They're very actively involved in this particular strand that we've been talking about. Values, attitudes, skills, and civic and political engagement. And in case you have forgotten, this is why we're doing it. We would like to find what relationships are there between the values, attitudes, and skills on the one hand, as Martyn pointed out, and civic and political engagement on the other. And we are focusing on civic and political engagement, and we try to identify some of the psychological factors which are related to citizens' commitment to democracy. We have two groups of respondents in terms of age. As you already know, these are students at school, and especially for the Bulgarian context, it's important to know that we have focused on the so-called Vtori gymnazialen etap, which is the higher high school stage. This, you know, after 2016, after the reform in Bulgarian secondary education, we have these two cycles at the upper secondary. And what is probably curious to learn is that in these 2 years of this cycle of the upper secondary, civic education is a subject of its own. Before that, issues, topics related with civic education are supposed to be taught through other subjects like Bulgarian language, foreign languages, history, geography, and so on and so forth. This is about, you know, the age difference, but we also have, you know, the other one, the different countries that we are collecting the data from. On the one hand, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Poland, these are all post-communist countries. Then we don't know what the results will be, but we can look for underlying similarities or differences in these three countries, but it will be interesting to see what the comparison says when we compare to Ukraine and when we compare to the data in the United Kingdom. So, because data for school students, you see, we have collected data from Bulgaria, UK, Lithuania, but we are going to collect from Poland as well over the next month. So what we are going to show you today is just a very, very preliminary first, you know. I also would like to say that we are very thankful to the school principals we contacted, because if you see the impressive number of, you know, the total number of surveys which were done at Bulgarian schools, this wouldn't have happened if the school principals did not believe and did not respond very positively and engaged in this study. So you see three different columns with full, so these are the full surveys, partial surveys which haven't been touched yet. There has to be a lot of analysis done for the partial surveys as well. And the data for UK suddenly disappeared, but I can tell you that they have 154 total and 146, I think, completed for school students. And they're still collecting the data for university students as are our Polish colleagues. So this is, Martyn showed the different aspects we are looking at and the different aspects we are collecting data about. But here I decided to focus on just a couple of examples. And what you can see on the screen, this is the result of the ICCS survey done in 2016. We used part of some of the questions used in this survey in our questionnaire. The thing is that in 2016, we have data for Bulgaria and Lithuania. And you can see, for example, that according to this survey, Bulgarian students are very likely to engage in illegal actions to show that they agree or disagree with something. Illegal actions being, you know, spraying on walls and things like that. While the Lithuanians are on the other opposite. Okay, so these are some more, this is from the survey which was run in 2022. Here we already have data for Bulgaria, Lithuania and Poland, so you can see some similarities and differences. But if you look at, you know, the data for 2016 compared to the data for 2022, in the Bulgarian results, there is a drop in all these behaviors. So fewer students said they would vote for class representative or for school parliament representative. And fewer students would become candidate, would run for such a, you know, campaign, so to say. And fewer students would take part in decision making about how the school is run. So this is not exactly the same in our findings, in our preliminary findings. And here I'm going to very briefly go through some of these. For example, so here you can see the comparison for students, university students, without the UK students because they're still doing the survey. And by the way, these are not the final figures because we're closing the survey for the students this week. So there might be a few more answers. I can't say at the moment. So if you see, for example, the initial hypothesis is that probably we are going to have similarities, but in our survey, it's not exactly like that. Yeah. Let's, for example, take part in a peaceful march or rally. So in Poland, yeah, you can see. In Lithuania, certainly 32% and probably 31.48%, which is more than in Bulgaria. So we were discussing yesterday with our colleagues who are specialists in sociology that, for example, it's been proven that in Bulgaria it's not, I mean, this is our culture. It's better not to say I categorically agree or I totally don't agree. So these, like probably and probably not answers, are more typical. Oh, let me show you another one. So in the 2016 survey, the answers for Bulgarian students taking part in online activities were, there weren't such answers. I mean, if I remember correctly, because the survey is not, I mean, you have to do the survey, but you can skip questions, right? So here we can see that some of the students would like to engage, but in this kind of behavior. So now let's take a look here at the third one, organize an online group to take a stance on a controversial political or social issue. Not such an impressive number of students would like to do that, would they? Participate in an online campaign. Yeah, slightly bigger numbers there. But look at the spray painting protest slogans on walls. And what a difference between the behavior in, I mean, expressed identification with behavior in Bulgaria, for example, Lithuania, and in Poland. Yeah. Blocking traffic. This is quite a common way to show that you disagree with something. So in Poland, look, and look what happens in Bulgaria. They seem to be at two, opposites here. Of course, this needs a little more analysis. Well, skip. I think I've repeated something. Yeah, spray painting, occupying public buildings. So those of people my age remember how the democratic revolution, so to say, started in Bulgaria, occupying Sofia University for quite a long time. 1.75% would do that to show they disagree with, a certain political issue. And I have specifically chosen these two questions about votes because it turns out that we are all going to vote in European parliamentary elections this year, but also in Bulgaria we're going to have another, parliamentary election. And in Lithuania they're running a presidential election as well, and in Poland they're running an election for local government. Yeah. So these are questions that are relevant to the students, and this is not in the survey, but because I know some of the students who completed it. Some of our students are going to be part of the election process here. They would be, they have something to do. They're going back to their home places and take part in these electoral committees. And yeah, and that's it. Here I would like to stop. Our data is very inconclusive. It's not, we haven't done any real statistical analysis yet. We haven't tested these hypotheses that Martyn showed. But yesterday when we were looking at this, although these are not representative samples, but convenience samples, we believe we have such an amount of data that can be explored in a variety of ways, including we could decide to pick out some of the most prominent features that come out of the statistical analysis and try to follow up with some more in-depth qualitative research. There are different opportunities to do that. So here I'm going to stop. Enough about the EUVaSC survey, and I would like to slightly switch on to a different topic, which is not so different because it's also part of the research strand on relevance and values of universities for the future. And those of you who were present yesterday probably remember that Professor Tsvetkova showed a couple of previous publications. We have been researching at the doctoral level, the PhD level, as a specific educational and research degree, and for quite a number of years. So this research is continuing. I mean, it has its predecessors, those two books which were published on doctorate as experience with a focus on supervision, identities, and language. That was the first one. Then the second one, which focused on examination, and how doctorate students and supervisors experience the process of examination at the third level. And now we are focusing on the public defense. And I'm going to give the floor to Professor Byram to explain a bit more, to show, you know, more glimpses of this research, which is also going on. We haven't finished yet. We are processing the data that we have collected. And here I would like to thank our colleague, Branimir, who is the postdoctoral student that is part of this particular research group. So, Mike, the floor is yours. Now you can try. I'll switch places. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as the great Monty Python cited already this morning said, and now for something completely different. Martyn, at the end of what he was saying, mentioned that at some point in the future, the work that they're doing would feed into and could feed into education policy. And the bigger picture for our project is education policy. But what you've got today is, from this morning, we had a very big picture, looking both into the future, into the past, and into the present. Then we've come down to a corner of that picture, as it were, a region of that picture, corner of that picture, and now we're coming down to a little detail in the corner of that corner. As Nina has said, we have been working on the PhD, for short, on doctoral education. PhD for short, because doctoral education these days is more than PhD. There are increasing numbers of professional doctorates, doctorate of education, doctorate of business administration, doctorate of theology, and so on. But we're not looking at the professional doctorates, we're looking at the traditional PhD. And as Nina said, and as Maria showed yesterday, we started some years ago with an emphasis upon, in our titles, as you can see here, in our titles, an emphasis on the word experience. So the first project was about the experience of supervising and being supervised. The second was about the experience of examining from the examiner's points of view. And this third project is about the specific experience of that part of examining which we call the defense. Because examining, of course, is not only the defense. The word experience is interesting, although I won't have time to go into it in great detail today, but the Australian linguist Anna Tsvetkova, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, talks about how the English word experience is, for example, very difficult to translate into German. And she cites those people who translated from Wittgenstein's original German into English. And in German, you've got two words, Erfahrung and Erlebnis. And I'm not sure about Bulgarian also. Maria's nodding. Right? So this is not the time to go into it in great detail, but Tsvetkova's point is that much of our Anglophone education research, which often talks about experience and, to use a phrase Martyn has used this afternoon, empirical research, is guided by the notion that we should be looking at experience, but without clearly identifying different aspects of experience. Now, I'm not sure that we are going to be able to do that in our book, but it's something that we certainly need to think about. End of digression. What I want then briefly to explain to you is what we're doing in this project. All of that you've seen before. As we've said, we've had 2 Routledge books with that word experience there, and now the experience of the defense. The word defense is in inverted commas, in quote marks, because of course when you start working in other languages, then you find that, for example, in French, the equivalent word, I'm not using the word translation, but the equivalent is soutenance. And soutenir, the verb behind the word soutenance, means to support. Defense has ideas of defending against attack. Someone in one of the articles that we've been looking at and summarizing as part of our literature review says if you mention defense to PhD students in England, because that's where the person was writing and thinking, it creates a sense of fear. And in fact, in England, we have another word, viva, which is short for viva voce, che, never quite sure how that should be pronounced because my Latin teacher never told me. But we have all of these different words have different connotations. In the United States, they use the word defense, but they have an S rather than a C. So overall, we're going to use the word defense with a C as a kind of umbrella term, knowing that within that term, whatever the word is in Bulgarian, which I forget, and in Chinese, which we also have, and in Danish, which is forsvar, and in Germany, which is disputatio, in some universities, all of those different terms are under this notion, this umbrella word defense, but we are aware of the variation in connotations in the so-called translations or equivalent words. And the same applies to all the terminology that we'll use. So we will use the word, or we are using the word thesis and dissertation interchangeably, but these two should be, so in a sense, in inverted commas throughout our text. We won't do that because it would look odd to just constantly have inverted commas, but that's an important dimension of this kind of comparative study. So where are we in more concrete terms? We have 11 universities in 10 countries because we have 2 universities in Germany. And as I'm sure you know, Germany has 16 education systems because each of the German Länder has its own education system. So we have 2 in Germany, and then the others you can see. But we have not here in this list used the names of the countries. We have universities which are in countries, but within countries, and the 2 German examples show us this, there is variation. It's not surprising in Germany since they have 16 education systems, but even within any other given country, that behind any of those words, any of those universities, you find a lot of variation. So our cases are cases of not even universities. They are cases of individual defenses in either social sciences faculties or humanities faculties. Therefore, we are clearly not, he said, anticipating, we're clearly not generalizing. What we are trying to do is open the door into what some people have called the secret garden of the PhD. And not least, open the door into the secret garden of the defense. Because even public defenses always have an aspect, there's always a moment, at least in all the ones that we know here, when the public is told to leave the room. And therefore, even in the so-called public defences, there's a secret garden. So you can see our list, and I will go on. What are we trying to do exactly? We're trying to describe ethnographically the experience, that word again, of all the participants, candidates, supervisor, sometimes supervisors in the plural, and examiners in these different cases. And then we want to try to analyze particular dimensions of the defense. And here are some of them. What do people think is the purpose of a defense? What do candidates think is the purpose of their defense? What do supervisors think? And so on. What kinds of defense are there? There is research, large-scale quantitative research on defenses, surveys of defenses. That's been done relatively recently. In fact, a lot of it by, including a colleague of mine in Durham. And they have come up with categorizations, like the defenses are, like public defenses now, forget England and so on, but public defenses are maybe judgmental or they may be ceremonial. Or actually, when you get down to the detail, they may be both. The large-scale surveys tend to categorize, in my view, a little bit too simply. And then other things, like the role of the supervisor. Sometimes he or she is involved in the examining, and they switch role. You know, today I'm your supervisor, tomorrow I'm your examiner. What does that feel like? What's that experience? Some people say it's just normal. That's what we've always done. Why are you asking me that question? That's the sort of issues that we will be raising. And then the relationships among examiners is an interesting area. Among examiners, but also relationships among all the participants. How are examiners selected? Why do they decide to accept an invitation? Some might say, well, he's a friend of mine or she's a friend of mine, so I'll do him or her a favor. That kind of thing might happen. In other cases, and in Portugal, in the example in Aveiro, recently they've been thinking hard about how friendships or network circles are at the basis of some of the selection procedures. Not only there, it happens elsewhere, but Diana, who's sitting at the back and done our case in Aveiro, tells us that the University of Aveiro is very, at this moment, as it were, reviewing what's happening and thinking about ensuring greater transparency in the selection of examiners. It might be something useful in other places too. However, that's just my comment. Right? And I must go on. So how do we do? How are we collecting data? We're looking at the regulations in each case. The regulations in the university, but also often specific regulations in a faculty. I made a mistake when I was writing up one of the studies. I just assumed that the Department of Linguistics, in which this case was based, was in the philology faculty. Why should I think that? However, I sent my analysis of the faculty regulations to the participants in the case, and they told me, no, we're not in philology, we're in philosophy. So I had to look at the regulations, which are slightly different. Even from faculty to faculty, the regulations are different. So that's just a little anecdote. Then we're collecting data with semi-structured interviews before and again afterwards. So for example, we're asking supervisors and participants, how do you decide when a thesis or dissertation is ready? As I said a moment ago, we're asking examiners about accepting invitations. We're also asking them about, how do you read? A number of people say, I get it electronically, but I always ask for it to be printed. And I do that too, I have to say. But how do you read? And what do you do with your notes and so on? How does this then feed into the process, the actual event of the defence on the day? And similarly, questions about how candidates and supervisors prepare for the defence on the day. Then we observe, and Maria was last week in the United States at UConn, University of Connecticut, observing minute by minute, making notes minute by minute, so that we will have a breakdown, well, minute by minute, perhaps not, but 5 minute by 5 minutes of what's actually happening in a defence. And then afterwards, semi-structured interviews with the participants again. Was the defence what they expected, and so on. I move on. Just to give you a feel for, you don't need to read this, but there is something from one of the observations. You can see the detail of the observation. From, no, where was it from? I can't remember. Yes, I can. I think this is from Augsburg. This is yeah. And you can see the detail of the description. And then at the end in Augsburg, there is a limit on the time. The defense may not last more than 90 minutes. In other places, there is no limit, and it may go on, well, from the perspective of the student, forever. And so you can see how at the end of this, the chair, who is the supervisor in this case, is rounding things up. So that's the level of detail that we have in the descriptions. I said a moment ago, we're not going to generalize. Perhaps I just stop that for a moment. Somebody asked me last week in one of the interviews, I mean, it's very difficult to find cases. It has been difficult. Above all, I think, because the university people are very busy, as we all know. And to get people to give you time is not easy. One person asked me last week, and what are you going to do in your book? Are you going to tell us what is the best kind of defense? And my answer was immediately no. That is not the purpose of the book, or indeed any of the previous 2 books. That's not the purpose of comparative education. The purpose is to give you insight into what's on the other side of the fence and how that might make you think about what we do in our field or in our garden. But nonetheless, we've been writing an article. Diana sitting at the back and Li Hong in Beijing and myself. We decided we would take some of the data already and write an article. And despite what I said about generalization from these cases, we have tried a little, because, well, that's another topic for another day about generalizing from cases. But there you can see a preliminary conclusion from our current article, where, among other things, we looked at purposes, but in particular, and this is what this relates to, the relationships among examiners or participants, examiners, supervisors, and candidates. And in these 2 cases, in Aveiro and in Beijing, some people know each other, some people don't. The candidate knows some of their examiners and not others. And we are coming to this kind of conclusion that the unknown, because we have this distinction between a public examination which is largely judgmental and a public examination which is largely ceremonial, according to the research that I referred to before. And it's not quite as simple as that. It can be both. And there seems to be, in these 2 cases, a tendency for the examiners who are coming from outside, let's say, not necessarily outside the university, but from outside and are unknown to the candidate and maybe even unknown to the supervisor, they tend to be the ones who focus on a judgmental function, whereas the ones who are known, in inverted commas, tend in their talk and in their feedback and in their interactions with the candidate on the day to be more, let's call it ceremonial, giving feedback, positive feedback, maybe ideas for the future. So there is maybe a little generalization we can find here, but it's something we would need to look at in other cases too. So that's where we are. We hope that that article will be published soon, but we all know there's many a step from submission to publication. But that's the first thing that will appear, and then the book will appear, we hope, next year, based on these cases. Thank you.
So thank you, Mike. And I would like to change a little bit the ceremony again. And rather than, asking specific questions to Professor Barrett and Professor Byram, I would like to invite the audience, if you have questions. Thank you for listening, thank you for being here. But have you, while listening to us, probably you would like to ask something or to comment on something? Do you feel what we're doing relevant? Can you identify with some of the questions we've been asking ourselves?
So going back to the first presentation, I want to ask you, by what we saw, obviously by the age of 16, the trends are kind of alarming regarding EU values and the attitudes of the young people. So do you have any idea, when you talk about educational policies in this field, when is the right age to start talking to children about EU values? When is the right time to include this in the educational program? Because I have, for example, a daughter, she's 11, and I already see that she's kind of confused. What is a human right? And they are having some history lessons, for example, and they are being asked questions, but they are not exposed to EU values at all at this age. And I believe it's the right time. Thanks.
Thank you. Really interesting question. I'm actually a developmental psychologist by background and training, and developmental issues, things linked to age and what is the right time, these are issues that are of great concern and interest to me. As I said before, in our project, we're drawing on one of the sources is the Council of Europe's reference framework of competencies for democratic culture, the RFCDC, which postulates 20 competencies. And in the documentation, we have said, and I think there's very good evidence for this, that it is a process covering the whole of the formal educational period. In fact, even from before, from preschool through to higher education. However, different competencies are more suitable for targeting at particular ages than other competencies. So give the one I mentioned before, empathy, in my presentation. Empathy you can work on already with 3-year-olds in preschool. There are things you can do to foster and encourage and promote and support the development of empathy. Then there are other competencies, for example, knowledge and critical understanding of economies and the environment, which I think are far more abstract and much more suitable for targeting at possibly upper secondary and maybe higher education levels. Human rights you can do in different ways at different ages. So you can do judgment tasks with quite young children, asking them about is the behavior in this situation appropriate or not? You wouldn't use the language of human rights. You would say, is it right that the child can make this decision? And you can ask this of a 6-year-old. But you wouldn't be using the language of human rights, which is very, very abstract. And I think the age at which the language, the abstract language of human rights would be appropriate would be at a much higher level, because the, you know, concept of indivisibility, you know, inalienable rights and so on, this terminology that's used in relationship to human rights, it's very abstract language, and you can't understand these concepts, I don't think, at a very young age. But you can be getting children to reason about specific scenarios, what is the right sort of thing to do at much younger ages. So I think you can't say there is an age at which this should be done in terms of the way you ask that question. I think across that full age range, there are different things that can be done at different ages using different pedagogies and methods of approach that would be suitable for those different ages.
And is there any educational system in Europe that can be an example how this is faced throughout the different years?
Don't look at me.
I'm because I'm a psychologist, Mike is the educationist, but Mike's saying don't look at him. I mean, I don't want to say it, but the Scandinavian countries, you know, they do things very well. So we have looked at the implementation of the RFCDC in a range of different countries. And so far, the RFCDC, the last quantitative survey of what has been done in which member states of the Council of Europe, so this is 46 countries that have been surveyed in that work, it was being implemented either in whole or in part in 22 countries, in the education systems of 22 countries. Finland, for example, you know, Pisa and Finland, you know, it's always at the top of all league tables. But actually, in Finland, they were already doing a huge amount of what's in the RFCDC. So it's very easy for them to say, we are implementing it largely in whole. It's not entirely in whole. But it's not couched in the language that the Council of Europe has been doing. So there is, if you like, implicit ways in which it is being done versus the more explicit. The most explicit country, if you want to look for an example, is Andorra, little tiny Andorra, which is actually the country in the Council of Europe that initiated the work that led to the reference framework. They are very proud of it as a political initiative. When they held the chair of the Council of Europe, their chairmanship led to the development of this framework, which brought together at the Council of Europe education for democratic citizenship, human rights education, and intercultural education. Three things that were being done, well, certainly intercultural education, and the other two were being done very separately beforehand. Andorra saw the need to pull all these strands together and have a more cohesive, unified framework. And they are very proud of it, and in fact, even before it was the final version of the framework was published, they were implementing it. So if you want to look at a complete implementation, tiny little Andorra in the Pyrenees would, I suppose, be the case study to actually look at. But I think effectively implicit implementations are happening in other countries, as well as fairly explicit in further countries as well. For example, in the Balkans and in Georgia, there's very explicit implementation. And actually Ukraine, one of the countries in our project, part of the whole shift to democracy within Ukraine, they bought lock, stock and barrel into the reference framework, and there's been massive training of teachers carried out in Ukraine. So Ukraine, there's a lot of terrific work going on there, actually. So it's being done in very different ways in different countries, and that's fine, that's as it should be, because the reference framework is very much, this is a set of recommendations, but it's up to you individual countries to implement in a way that is suitable for your education system.
Martyn has, in a sense, implicitly corrected that by reminding you that the Council of Europe has 46 member states, and the EU has, I forget, 27? It was 28, I believe, at one point. Right? We must be careful about using phrases like European values. Why? I've looked, for example, at the English national curriculum, and I've looked at other national curricula. And they all talk about, in the English national curriculum, they talk about British values. They don't distinguish between England and the rest. They talk as if these values which are listed are somehow only British. And there is then in the discourse a tendency, perhaps here too, to say European values as if they were not shared and not to be found in the rest of the world. Martyn's Schwarz work, not Martyn's work, but Schwarz's work alluded to by Martyn, reminds us about that. But the discourse is important, and we must be careful about how we talk about these things. That's just my little comment as a linguist.
Thank you, Mike. And just a little comment prompted from Laura's question and what Martyn explained. I think what Laura raised as an issue in the Bulgarian context goes back to the need for relevant teacher training.
I was thinking whether you are planning to, or whether you are connecting the values revealed by the survey with particular socio-political conditions in the countries that you are investigating. I thought of this when I saw the question about protesting and blocking the streets. So could that be connected with particular traditions in certain countries about ways in which people protest?
I'll give a very brief answer, and then I'll let my colleagues continue. Because yesterday, actually, we were discussing this mass of answers, even inconclusive, even very raw data at the moment, that there are so many potential analyses to be run that probably we won't have, enough time, not until the end of the project, but probably for years after. But there may be cultural specifics in the way that our respondents responded in the way that they did.
I was thinking what would be the outcome of that question if you asked our students in Argentina, where we have so many blockages of streets every day.
Yes. Yeah. Well, to answer your question directly, I think the macro context is absolutely crucial. The work I've done before, for example, I ran an EU project which ran in 9 European countries. In each country, we had 3 different ethnic groups, the national majority group and 2 ethnic minority groups. We found differences in each of those groups, but they were not replicated where you might expect in parallel ethnic minority groups in other countries. With a colleague, we ran multi-level modelling, not using the data from our project, but from things like the European Social Survey, where you've got you've got data from many, many different countries, and we were looking precisely at macro-level effects and whether these exist, and the evidence is absolutely unambiguous. You have macro level effects, you've got sociological level effects, you've got psychological and demographic differences, and so on. And my fundamental conclusion from that whole project was how everything varies once you go from one country or setting or cultural setting within a country to another, from one subpopulation within that cultural setting to another, and to quote Mike, impossible to generalize, other than to say the variability, and that there are factors or variables at all levels of analysis. We did do the study in conjunction with political scientists, sociologists, and so on, and everyone was looking at their level of analysis, and there was evidence for effects at all levels. So yes, the macro context and the institutional context, I think. and the political opportunity structure that a set of institutions makes available within a particular country is absolutely crucial. And if that changes, citizen behaviour changes as well. So we haven't got enough countries to run that sort of multi-level modelling in our project. You need data from probably 50, at a hunch, 50 different countries to be able, which you can do using the large international social surveys that are out there, and that's what we did in that project. But you can't do it with just 5 countries. And of course, while 4 of the 5 are post-communist countries in our project, you know, even there, we are going to, you know, no question, Ukraine, the current circumstances in Ukraine, I am sure, is going to impact upon the results. But we're talking about Poland, for example, which is also extremely close to the conflict, has had a huge wave of migration from Ukraine. You know, there's Lithuania is a different country, a different setting where they may not have had the same magnitude of migration from Ukraine, but are threatened in a similar parallel sort of way. And the UK, which has its own problems, which I'm sure our colleague in the audience who's speaking about her UK-Bulgarian study this morning could actually say something about, you know, is a totally different context yet again. So, yeah, sorry, long-winded, but everything is different once you go from one group to another, let alone from one country to another.
If I understood correctly, the data in Ukraine were collected before the war.
No. All the data are collected now. I mean, we're continuing. We haven't closed the UK student, university student data and the Polish and the Lithuanian school student surveys yet. But we started in January, late January,
Okay.
and these were the figures from last week. But no more in Ukraine.
Okay.
I mean, they're all the data are being done now. Yeah.
So I don't have a question.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists for the second panel, representing this enormous strand, which incorporates several very interesting and diverse topics. But I think we are fascinated by what they presented, so thank you very much. And with this, I would like to close what shall we call it, information session of interim information session of our project, because we will have 2 more years to go. So you can expect in 1 year again to see what we have done. And obviously at the end with publications and with books. And also with networks, yes, that are very important. And the important thing is that we are creating international networks as well, and we are very closely working with our colleagues, and I think that can sustain in the future. So thank you very much. And with this, I would like to close our session. Thank you.